also spared noble ears from the noises of my entry. They also stacked. There was no way of knowing what lay above the council room, but because of the placement of that central sewer shaft, the guard ropes had to be built one above the other, and the suite above my original entry point belonged to King Ashvik. With my feet straddling the hole in the floor, I pressed my ear trumpet against the door. Only after I felt sure there were no elites in the room beyond did I ease the door open.
KO. Round 2.
The withdrawing room was dark, save for a thin line of light coming under the door that corresponded to the bedchamber in the room below. I was at the most dangerous stage of my mission, with the king likely sleeping behind one door, and elite bodyguards and stone dogs possibly behind the other. The temptation to go for the king as quickly and quietly as possible was almost overwhelming. Instead, I drew my left-hand sword and forced myself to listen at the door to the sitting room. It was empty. I checked the eye the goddess had given me for the king. It was loose in its sheath, ready to find a home in a royal heart. I crossed to check the door to the bedchamber. The king was in, and likely awake. The door opened away from me and was hinged on the left side, so I switched to my right-hand sword. Now. Ashvik was sitting on the edge of a chaise, facing a window that looked out over the palace, his back to me.
I told you I was not to be bothered. If you're here for anything less than an invasion from Kotamia, I'll have you boiled alive. Maybe in the bath right here.
He pointed at a big red marble tub in the corner. I slipped my second sword free of its sheath.
Well, spit it out. Why have you come?
To bring you justice.
What?
Ashvik spun in his seat. I plunged one sword into his chest and the other into his throat. For a couple of heartbeats, his eyes blazed hate at me. But then, as easily as a sheep slaughtered for the table, he died. Ashvik VI, the king of Zard, butcher of Kadesh, and murderer of his own royal sons, simply slumped gently backward and slid off my blades. And I felt nothing. As I had been taught, I flicked the swords to clear the blood, then resheathed them at my back. Next, I arranged the dead king on the chaise, as though he were sleeping. I took the Eye of Namara from its sheath and sank it deep into Ashvik's chest, making sure that the blue lapis eye on its pommel stared straight at the door. Turning away from the body, I left the room and closed the door behind me, never looking back. Using light magic and stealth, I made it back through the guard robe, prince's apartments, council chamber, and out onto the balcony.
Round 3.
I tucked myself up against the railing in a shadowy corner. Now, I just needed the body to go undiscovered for the hour or so until the next shift change gave me a chance to slip out without being spotted by the elite in the courtyard below. After about 10 minutes, the enormity of what I had just done started to sink in. My goddess had set me a task, and I had succeeded, where 3 older and more experienced blades had failed. Namara had put her faith in me, just as I put my faith in her, and for her, I had removed a monster from the world. Though it took months for the name to attach itself to me, I was in that—
My lord!
8, 9. By 10, he would have checked the body and found it still warm, though not warm enough.
Oh no.
11. If I was lucky, the elite would make a quick search and find the trapdoor I'd cut in the guard rope floor before sounding the alarm. 17. Opening it would trigger my fire ward and light the smudge candle I'd left in the waste shaft. 19. My thoughts were interrupted at 20.
Men, prepare for action!
There was no way the Crown Guard's commander would miss me blotting out the stars as I sail-jumped across the courtyard above him, nor fail to see me when he looked up. But I couldn't wait for a better opportunity. I stood, took 2 running steps, jumped, and launched myself from the rail of the balcony. I traded a 2-story drop for about 70 feet of horizontal glide. I landed on the curtain wall that separated the Grand Tower from the main palace. At that point, I had to make a sudden change of plans when what looked like half the Zani army stampeded out of their barracks and into the middle of my exit strategy. Instead of another sail jump, like I intended, I turned and ran along the top of the wall. I ran to the farther of the 2 towers the wall connected, the one that housed the royal kitchens. From there, I started working my way toward the formal ballroom. That's when I ran into an elite lieutenant named Dean and his stone dog, name unknown. Dressed and masked in grays and wearing my shadow as a cloak, I had seen him before he saw me. Convinced of the approval of my goddess and flushed with thoughts of success. Certain that I was the best there'd ever been, I'd wanted no dead guards staining my record of a clean kill on the king. I tried to slip past him unseen, but the hall was too brightly lit, and the darkness that concealed me also betrayed my presence.
Round 4.
He lunged at me, missing his thrust and leaving himself open to a low return as Triss shifted one way and I the other to confuse his aim. None of Namura's servants would have faulted me for killing him, but I wanted no other arrows showing on the butt to distract from a perfect bullseye on Oshvin. Instead of aiming for an artery, I'd thrust for the big nerve cluster where thigh met groin. Fool. I spun away, then used the wall as a backstop and launched myself high over the body in a bit of over-fancy and frankly show-offish footwork. That's when his stone dog came up through the floor, clawing and biting. The dog shredded my boot and carved bloody furrows in my left calf and heel. I won the pass, but almost lost a leg in the process. The rest of my trip out of the palace went by in a sort of nightmare blur.
Don't let him get away! To kill the king! Find him, you fools!
I honestly can't tell you how I managed to come out the other end in one piece.
Round 1. Fight.
I bear the scars to this day and count it as light payment for the lesson driven home. You can never let your pride trump your professionalism, not if you want to live. In combat, you have to sort people into 2 categories. There are targets, and there's everybody else, and you kill the targets. No exceptions.
KO.
I'd forgotten that then, and it had nearly got me killed.
Fight.
I don't even remember how I got from the palace to the snug I'd set up as my fallback, in case I couldn't get out of Tien immediately after the execution. I'd like to say that Namura guided and guarded me, and I know I thought so at the time. But these days, I've come to doubt that the gods intervene so directly. If Namura were that powerful, why did she need us to act as her hands? No, the answer is probably Triss, whispering in my ear and guiding my steps in the right direction, just as he so often has. My snug was an attic storeroom in a great house not too far from the palace. It belonged to an out-of-favor viscount who had removed himself to his country estates for health reasons.
Fight.
In other words, he thought it healthier to stay far away from the king, whose displeasure he'd incurred. The place only had a skeleton staff for the duration, and the room I'd adopted as my own chiefly held storm shutters and other winter necessities. I spent the next several days wandering the edges of delirium, waking only now and then to chew a few Efik beans handed me by Triss and wash down with tepid water. I felt terribly weak and shaky when I finally decided to venture out on the 4th day, but I'd run out of beans the night before, and I needed Efik then more than I've ever needed alcohol since. Wrapping bandages around my torn calf made the flesh feel like I'd poured boiling water over it. Up to that point, Triss had kept my wounds bound in his own shadow stuff, providing another of the many benefits to partnering a shade. For reasons we didn't understand, that proximity to the Everdark cooled and soothed as well as any snowpack while simultaneously warding against wound rot. I'd need to do some careful work with cosmetics if I wanted anyone to believe I was a Zani noble from anything closer than a few yards away. Rummaging through the master's wardrobe, I unearthed a beautifully made but long out of fashion suit of court clothes and a pair of overlarge riding boots that accommodated my bandages. Getting one of the cart horses saddled and out of the stables was easy enough once I'd set the mulch pile on the far side of the house afire. Everything but my swords packed down into the saddlebags with room to spare. rode out onto the road in front of the estate and turned left toward the palace.
Where are we going?
Varia.
That's on the wrong side of Tien.
That's what they'll be thinking too, if the search hasn't already moved out of the city. If the lieutenant lived, he'll have told them it was a blade. They'll be watching the roads to Godamia, so I'm gonna go south along the coast into the Mage Lands. Then I can cross the mountains through the high pass at Dalridia. It'll take longer, but it's less risky.
Except for the part where we have to ride so close to the palace.
I need Aphid for the trip home, Triss. Little Varia's the only place in Tien I can get it. My leg's still pretty bad.
True, though I wish it wasn't. All right, we'll have to be quick about it.
Really, Triss, it'll be fine. I'll be fine. I know what I'm doing. But if I didn't get another bag of beans soon, I was going to shake myself to pieces. Maybe the past did hold the keys to the present. I hadn't found my lost self in my memories, though the quivering Ephic addict who just killed a king had all too much in common with the drunk wearing that same skin today. But I did know exactly where to look for Devon now, and for that, I can thank the Ethan. It was funny, really, but when I'd been a blade, it had never occurred to me to think of Ethan as anything other than a tool of my trade. A dangerous one, to be certain, but just another tool I used. Even when I'd given up Ephic after I came back to Tien, I hadn't seen it as more than that. I quit because the old Arl the Kingslayer, drank Ephic when he could get it and chewed the beans when he couldn't, just like all the other blades. And every damned bean provided another reminder of the life the Son of Heaven had stolen from me. At the same time, Arl the Kingslayer had never touched alcohol. So when it came time to let the Kingslayer go, to really become Arl the Jack, I drank myself unconscious every day for a week. It was the best method I could see for making a break between the two lives. It had honestly never occurred to me that I was just swapping one drug for another. I hadn't touched Ephic since then, but I remembered exactly how it tasted and how it made me feel, and I knew exactly where to find it. All three of the illegal taverns were in Little Varia. If Devon wanted Ephic, that's where he'd have to go to find it, and that's where I'd find it. I stepped out to peek over the library's little balcony. It was dark and still, a few hours yet before the delivery people and the house servants responsible for feeding the well-to-do would start to make their scurrying pre-breakfast rounds. A sharp contrast with the Stumbles, or Smuggler's Rest, neighborhoods where things never quieted down completely. I turned and looked over the river flowing by on my left. A thought occurred to me.
KO.
Could you follow a shadow across the... Twice as I made my way toward Little Varia, customs cutters slid in close and played their big mage lanterns over my boat. But there was nothing to see except for me, my shadow, and a tiny pack tucked under the thwart. That last might possibly have gotten me stopped and briefly searched on a slow night, but not now, with farmers bringing in early shipments from the southwest, fishermen hauling in their late catch, and shippers moving loads they didn't trust to the crush of day traffic. The canal ended at the base of the Channery Hill, in an artificial bay where the nobles living at the top of the slope kept a small but fancy marina. I paused at the foot of the dock and took a second look around, borrowing Triss's senses for a moment, so I could see beyond the end of my nose. I didn't spot anyone other than the dozing guard at the marina gate, and a couple of day-working drunks staggering their way home from the taverns to catch a too-short sleep.
KO. Round 2.
With a roll of my shoulders, I started forward, up the half-dozen steps that led from dock to lane. I flipped my sword to an underhand grip and tucked it back against my shoulder rather than resheathing it. The darkened steel of the blade would blend well enough with the gray of my overshirt in this light. At the top, I turned right, headed for a narrow, unmarked door wedged into an improbably short wall between a tailor's and a cobbler's. The door headed a steep stair that led down to the Cat's Gratitude. The illicit tavern occupied a low cellar filled with dim light, tiny tables, and people who'd rather not be recognized. I didn't bother going inside, just walked past about 6 inches from the door while Triss had a bit of a sniff around. I knew that he missed the mark. Devon was not inside. I continued along my way till I hit a slim gap between two of the buildings fronting the lane. The scuttling flight of a startled rat allowed me a moment's relaxation, signaling as it did an otherwise empty darkness.
Out of character now, wouldn't it?
Happy?
Delighted.
Good.
I turned up the street and headed for the western edge of Little Varia, where it butted up against the Down Unders as the coast road entered Tien. The Down Unders had started out as a shanty town, catering to the drovers and traders who dealt in goods and animals that were too cheap or otherwise unsuited for ship travel, and it had never really recovered from its squalid beginnings. The streets got narrower and dirtier as I got closer and closer to the dead man's pouch, offering 1,000 hiding places for a blade waiting to strike. Once again, I slipped my left-hand sword free of its sheath to carry against my shoulder. The dead man stood between a more reputable sort of tavern on its right and a flop house on its left. A signpost without a sign hung over the front door in a subtle nod to the alley knocker's name. In Tien, a dead man's pouch was usually gone before the body hit the ground. The windows were boarded over, and several big planks appeared to have been nailed across the door as well, though the latter were just for show. You couldn't open the door from this side, but that was because of a huge iron latch that opened easily enough from the inside. Quite a few patrons left by the front door, though most entered by knocking on the alley side door, which was the origin of the term alley knockers, also occasionally called three knocks. I just turned toward the pitch-black gap on the flophouse side when Triss slapped me sharply in the soles of both feet. He was letting me know he'd tasted Devon's trail. I kept walking as if nothing had happened, though it took a huge effort of will not to look around or reach for my second sword. The narrow gap ahead seemed suddenly twice as dark, a perfect place for an ambush, steadily shifting my practically invisible shadow so that it reached out toward the gap ahead of me. As soon as my shadow's head touched the near absolute darkness of the space between the buildings, I felt Triss flowing out and away from me, extending himself to invisibly check the whole of the narrow passage. A moment later, I got a reassuring squeeze on my left foot. The way was empty, both of Devon and his traces, but I didn't relax.
Clear.
The traces in the street out front? Coming or going?
Going. And quite easily. It got stronger as it moved away from the dead man's porch.
KO.
But I couldn't sense any hint of his
Final
arrival here.
Let's circle around the main door then and see if Devon came in that way before we decide whether to follow him or see where he's backtracked.
A quick slide around the courtyard revealed that Devon had arrived by coming north across the roofs from the direction of the nastiest part of the Down Unders. Looping back to the front of the alley knocker, we checked Devon's departure trail, which headed north and west toward the Palace Hill and the bulk of the city. So, follow Devon? Or see if we could find out what brought him to the Down Unders? I didn't have time to do both, not with dawn less than 2 hours away.
The sky?
7 or 8 aging and out-of-fashion great houses hugged the cliff edge 150 feet overhead, and that only counted the visible ones in easy sailing distance given the height.
Now there's an unhappy
Round
thought.
1.
One that should have
Fight.
occurred to me before you said something.
Unlike the houses around the palace or the Marchand estate, where the nobles and merchant princes kept the neighborhood exclusive, these cheapest of Tien's great houses could belong to practically anybody. The Channery Hill houses provided a perfect environment for a renegade blade looking for a snug. Time to start looking for the fastest way up the bluff.
Come on, Triss. We better climb up and have a look.
We don't have enough time to check even half of the houses before the morning sun burns off Sass's trail.
KO.
You are right. Finding Devon's
Round
snug
2.
will be virtually impossible.
Fight.
We want to look for the crown guard watching.
A dense rose thicket provided a good vantage on 3 of the 5 best choices. The first pair of guards lay hidden in a hollow carefully excavated under a huge patch of imperial roses gone feral. They wore mottled green from head to toe, and green and brown paint on their faces. The only way I could even tell they were crowned guard was by the dragon crown insignia engraved on the deliberately verdigreed guard of the sword strapped across the nearer of the pair's back. It was clearly visible even in the pre-dawn light. So close had I come before I saw them. If not for Triss's enshrouding presence, and the fact that I'd approached them from behind and with a good deal of stealth, they would certainly have seen me well before I spotted them. Even just crossing in front of them might have given me away if they were waiting for Devon, and I had to assume they were. They'd be just as happy to nail up my skin as Devon's. Might not even know they'd gotten the wrong man. As soon as I'd retreated to a safe distance, I set out just as cautiously to look for others. I found a round dozen, including a command post a fair distance back from the main perimeter on the upslope.